So, Heather, there are a couple of big stories. I mean, the obviously the ongoing story is the tremendous explosion of COVID infections and deaths in this country. On Thursday, or I should say on Wednesday, December 16th, we're recording this on Thursday, we had 245,000 infections, 33,611 deaths, and 113,000 people hospitalized. And I went back, and my understanding has been to measure deaths relative to infections today. You take the infections today, you multiply it between 1.4% and 1.8%, and that gives you a range, and you look out 16 to 21 days. 240, I mean, to have 3,600 deaths, and, you know, we don't know if they happened exactly today or maybe they were recorded a little bit later. If you go back 2 weeks, 16 days, 21 days, you're on the high end of the rate. In other words, it's closer to 1.8% death rate than 1.4%. And I can't help but think that might be a function of some hospitals reaching capacity. Maybe they're not necessarily advertising it, but they're having to make decisions about who they can care for in these, and who gets the most immediate care. When I mean, this is what the whole flatten the curve was about. And so we have this situation with 245,000 deaths on December 16th. I mean, we could be looking on January 1st for over 4,000 deaths a day. And this week it was revealed, there was a story in the Times about how the CDC was essentially just, sort of strangled in terms of its function as a scientific, health agency, and that there was amongst top health and human services political appointees a specific agenda to create herd immunity, a secret one from the country. And this stuff is, I don't know if it's criminal, but it feels like it should be. I mean, literally criminal.
I agree with you. It's hard for me to see how this isn't criminal, or at least in some way civilly liable in some way, that there has to be some form of accountability for that. I mean, number one, it was secret, right? They swore up and down. I'm talking about the herd immunity thing. They swore up and down that they were not, in any way officially endorsing that as their strategy. And we've now found out that of course it was, and we knew it because Trump kept saying it, right? I mean, you know how he is. He just he can't help but sort of say the quiet part out loud, as the saying goes. And so he said this more than once. We call it herd, he said at one point, which was a tip-off. That was a very strange way of putting it, right? We call it herd, he said, in an interview that he gave. And then we see this stuff coming from this guy. His name is Alexander, and he was a part-time professor at some college up in Canada. Really, not in any way a qualified person to be setting any kind of
public policy,
official public policy of any kind, much less a scientific policy like this. And he was hired by Michael Caputo, who is a right-wing operative. Nothing more. He was hired into the HHS and, sort of installed there to run this sort of public relations side of the pandemic. And clearly, I mean, he's just a right-wing operative. He's nothing more than that. He had no expertise in anything like this. And obviously, their position was that they wanted to play down the pandemic, just as Trump had told Bob Woodward he was doing, and also to, put out this idea that they didn't want to do anything about the pandemic, that they were that they had decided that the best way to deal with it was to open up the country and let it run its course. And Trump said over and over, it's going to go away. It will just go away. And, we call it herd. And this guy Alexander used that same phrase. It's called herd, and it's a weird way of putting it because most people say herd immunity, right? But this guy said it in those exact words, and I remember picking that up. I wrote about it at the time, about Trump using that odd phrase. I'm going, what is that? At one point he said herd mentality, but that was a mistake. But he said this in a very specific way, which leads me to believe that he was aware of this guy, this
right.
particular guy, and using this particular guy's phrasing. And they had thought it through. And we had heard earlier about Jared Kushner saying, hey, we don't want to bail out the blue states, let the blue state governors take the blame for the pandemic and all of this. And there was early on a report in the Washington Post that had Donald Trump at a meeting of the coronavirus task force in which he said, why don't we let this just wash over the country? And Fauci is quoted in there, and he was he was confused. It was such a bizarre thing to say. And he says, well, what are you talking about? Just let everybody get it, is what Trump said. And Fauci said, well, we can't do that because, there will be massive deaths. And at that point, Trump kind of went, apparently, oh, okay. And I think that was at the point in the spring when Trump sort of decided that he'd give it a couple of weeks. It was before Easter, when he said he wanted to open up the pews. And he, for a little while there, he acted for a couple of weeks like he actually cared.
Right.
And I think that came out of that meeting, but it never left Trump's mind that this herd immunity was his ticket. This is what they decided to do. So I guess my point is this was an unofficial policy of the Trump administration, obviously. And they had people pushing it in various ways throughout the administration. They had these political appointees at the CDC. He brought in Scott Atlas, and he was also a herd immunity guy. They had political hacks stationed at Health and Human Services doing PR on this and, trying to push this through. You had people like Ivanka actually editing press releases for the CDC, according to that New York Times article. So this was an unofficial policy, and that is, how can we let that go? I just don't think that this is something. There's a lot of stuff about the Trump administration, the corruption from, top to bottom, all the obstruction of justice and the Russia investigation. There are a gazillion things you can look at. This one has to be done after the Biden administration takes over, one way or the other, whether it's the Congress or whether it's a commission or whether it's the Department of Justice or something. Somebody has got to do something here because, this is massive numbers of deaths, and it appears now the evidence is emerging that they did this on purpose. They did this consciously, knowing what they were doing. And that is, I don't know, we've had some pretty bad crimes in our history.
Right.
Genocide of the Indians, slavery, and all that. But, I'm going to say this is up there. This is up there with the worst thing any president has ever done, and we can't let it slide. We just can't. Now, I know he's going to be out there screaming that the election was stolen, and he's got this whole cult behind him that's not going anywhere right now. But this has got to stop. And I don't know if the revelation of this would be enough to make anybody think. It doesn't appear that it would affect his followers in any way. But this has got to be documented some way. And it's got to be there, if we, this is 9/11 level, right? There they have to just go in and basically document the whole thing and get people under oath and start talking to them, and and if there is any hope of criminal or even civil liability for it, they have to do it. Am I wrong? This.
No,
I was shocked by this. I was shocked.
I think that first off, I don't know what kind of, liability is associated with this.
Yeah, I don't either.
But I'll tell you the sort of the low hanging fruit in terms of why you would justify this is so that when we get COVID 2025, or when it's whatever it is, that this is never, ever, ever, ever attempted again, and that any indication that it's being I sound like a broken record, but I mean, like, this is, you want to talk about a failure of governance under a conservative administration. I mean, this is, you do this so that it never happens again. You do this so that people, educate some small percentage of the voting population, the population at large, that there's a fundamental difference between people who believe in government and people who don't. This was, this approach is a fundamentalist approach, right? And, Donald Trump, I think, was just like, for him, it's just like, oh, it's the easiest one.
Right.
It's the one. And I mean, one of the things about fundamentalism, and I'm quite convinced, when I say this fundamentalism, I'm talking about religious fundamentalism, is, the idea that herd immunity, we know it is a fact that there has never been a successful response to an epidemic or a pandemic that involves natural herd immunity.
Right.
You achieve this through vaccination if you can, but you don't just do, because, I mean, look, we can just look at the numbers. I mean, there have been 17 million cases reported in this country. Let's just, for the heck of it, double that number, right? Let's just say there's 35 million people who have been infected. In fact, let's do it times 4. Let's say there's 75 million people who have been infected, right? That gets you, I don't know, let's say maybe 25% of the American population. Well, anywhere you need to get for herd immunity has got to be like 60%. So you're talking about the deaths of another, I don't know, 500,000 people minimum to get to that herd immunity. If you can, if you're lucky to get it at 60%, and B, you can say, like, okay, we're not going to bust through 60%. Like, we're going to land on 60%. Like, it's you're talking about the deaths of, anywhere from 800,000 to, I don't know, 2 million people. And to achieve that, if that's even theoretically possible, because at one point people are going to be like, I don't want to catch this because I got too many people who are dying. Never mind the long-term impact of getting this, which we don't know.
Exactly.
And so, at the very least, you need to do this so that the idea of this is completely made toxic. And this level of fundamentalism, like I say, for Trump, I think it was an easy answer, but that's what fundamentalism is, right? Like, it is, you wake up in the morning, if you're a religious fundamentalist, or I guess any other type of fundamentalist, you wake up in the morning and there's a lot of decisions you don't have to decide because your life is made a lot easier because there's certain foods you can't eat, there's certain clothes you can't wear, there's certain places you can't go to, there's certain social dynamics you don't have to deal with. Everybody knows their place because they've been told what it is, and if you're lucky, you're at the top of that heap. And so, this is sheer insanity, and the Democrats really, really have to dig into this. I suspect that they might, as a way, in some ways, of like avoiding some of the other things, right? That the other types of corruption that maybe you don't want to push too much in that regard.
You may be right about that, and certainly there's going to be there are a lot of incentives for them to, shove some of this under the, sweep it under the rug for their own reasons, as you just implied, and also just because it's a very heavy lift, right? I mean, they would have to do a lot of work, and I think they're kind of hoping that the legal system, maybe in the state of New York, will take care of some of that and sort of expose him as the corrupt operator that he is, and maybe the Department of Justice, there'll be some stuff sort of left over, some of these investigations that will somehow hit him, and they can maybe avoid having to get too far into it. Certainly, I don't think, I don't get the sense that Biden wants to do that, and in fact, I get the sense that maybe they're thinking, because this week they decided, Jerry Nadler And with Pelosi's approval, they've decided to pursue this McGahn subpoena into the new Congress, which is what the Republicans were hoping would not happen. And they're fighting this through the courts. I don't know if people remember this, but this is basically on a position of principle, which the White House for the first time said that anybody who worked in the White House and worked for the president had what they called absolute immunity, which meant they didn't have to respond to any subpoenas from the Congress. Now, it's sort of been wending its way through the courts. It got sent back. There were a number of things, and normally at the end of a Congress, a lot of things expire, and you kind of have to say, well, we didn't get her done. But in this case, and they've done this many times in the past, they have made decisions to carry things over, and they do it officially, and there's plenty of precedent for it. They've decided to do that with this case, which on the issue of principle is hugely important, right? I mean, if the Congress can't subpoena anybody from the White House, and they won't cooperate and won't come down and speak to them, on an unofficial basis or anything, I think then congressional oversight is pretty much neutered. There's no way to do it, with any kind of a presidency. Now, going through the courts, I think this is one thing that's smart. They're going to keep pursuing it through the courts. Now you've got conservative courts that will be dealing with that issue with a Democratic administration,
right,
which will test them on this, right? I mean, do they want Joe Biden to not be able to respond to Lindsey Graham's subpoenas? I mean, who knows? But in any case, I guess my point is, sorry for the digression, is that there are certain things they're going to be pursuing on the basis of principle, and those will sort of sweep in some of this stuff with Trump corruption. It'll be part of it in a way. But I think that you're absolutely right, that this particular issue, which is just of such a, I mean, this is 300,000 people are dead.
Yeah.
I mean, this is one way for them to get at that, and I think that it's an important way for them to get at it. And I'm not sure that the Congress is the best place to do it. I'm almost thinking that this is one of those situations where you need a big, high-powered commission with a lot of power to investigate and do all kinds of things. And I'm kind of hoping that Biden goes that way, or at least, at the very least, some kind of joint committee where they have, both houses of Congress working on it together, because it's really important. I mean, this is absolutely disgusting, and it kind of does, in its own way, say everything about what's happened over these past 4 years. I mean, it's got the corruption. There's all kinds of stuff in that, too, with how many of these contracts were awarded to buddies, with Jared running his own little shadow task force and all. There was a lot of stuff in this that kind of encapsulates the entire Trump administration, and it's
right.
the low point, obviously.
And so that is, one, I guess, sort of half of our reality today. The other half of that reality is the stimulus fight that is ongoing. As of today, Thursday, they are now signaling that they may have to both extend the continuing resolution another week because they want to avoid a government shutdown. And they want to sign off on a $1.4 trillion basically operating budget for next year. And they are also still negotiating the COVID relief bill, which has now been broken off, as people know, I think by now, into two essentially segments. One segment has the most controversial provisions. One is Mitch McConnell's corporate liability shield, so that corporations are not liable for harming their workers or harming their customers in the event that they cut all sorts of corners in trying to sell their products. It also undermines work safety laws and like statutory responses by the government, not just a civil liability. It is a full-on liability. They cannot be held accountable for any, health and safety violations, essentially. And that is coupled with $180 billion worth of city and state money to go to prevent programs from shutting down and firefighters from being fired. And let's be honest, it's mostly like teachers being fired is usually what they tend to do. And then the other one has uninsurance extensions, uninsurance extensions and expansion in terms of who it's covered, or I should say continuations of these programs. A lot of them are ending on December 26th, and about 12 to 13 million people are going to be without a job, but also without any unemployment benefits. And then on top of that, an extra $300 per week. There is also a $600 a one-time payment to people making less than $75,000 in the country. But that money is coming out of the extension on the unemployment insurance. It's not going to go 16 weeks. I think it's going to go closer to 8 weeks or 12 weeks. And there's PPP money in there, and there's some money for hospitals to do inoculations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are. And the interesting thing is that came out just this week or late this week. Mitch McConnell is very worried about not passing something because it seems to be hurting Loeffler and Perdue in Georgia, and they have a runoff election on January 5th. And so the Democrats seem to have some leverage. The question is, will they use it?
Well, you're right. And, before we get into the analysis, can I just ask you, whatever happened to, is the eviction moratorium part of this, or does that come out of the CDC? I can't remember how that works. The
eviction moratorium would go for a month, and then presumably Joe Biden's administration could get the CDC to issue another one. And there's something like $25 billion in rental assistance, which I think most experts say is not totally sufficient, but will help in some regard. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation. I mean, that is, and we don't know what's going to be in the final bill exactly, but they seem to be, pushing around these numbers, and they are determined to keep a cap on the dollar figure at $908 billion because apparently that's the magic number.
It's the same thing going back to 2008, remember, or 2009 when they were doing the stimulus after the financial crisis. Is we got to keep it under $1 trillion. I mean, I just don't understand that. It's like, who are you trying to kid? What is the point of that? But apparently this means something to somebody. I don't even know who. But it is interesting what you say about McConnell, because watching him over the past month or so, it's been very interesting to see how him navigate this. We don't really know where he was on the various negotiations up to this point. He kept very quiet about it. He indicated that he had a bunch of, right-wing fanatics in his caucus, that he couldn't bring them on board, and he didn't want to have it be a deal where it was majority Democrats who passed it, because that would be bad for Donald Trump, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there was a lot of talk about that, and I've never really been able to sort of pin down. It'll be interesting to read, the real TikTok on this if we can get it. Somebody will write it up about how all that went down. But now we're at this point where it seems that he really does want to get this through, and because he is a nihilistic, evil Grim Reaper, I think what he's saying is true. The only reason I could imagine him really wanting to do this, particularly now that the election is over, is because of Loeffler and Perdue. I believe that really is his reasoning here, which is interesting, isn't it? Because, apparently somebody in something that I read today, I can't remember, in Politico, I think, talking about this, he's seeing ads in Georgia, and I don't know who's doing it. I don't know if it's Warnock and Ossoff.
They're outside expenditure ads, as far as I know.
Well, that's interesting, because somehow or another that's hitting, and however this comes down on this particular negotiation and this extension that they're looking for, I think that's telling about going forward for Democrats. I mean, if that's actually something, who would have thought, right? giving people material help in the middle of a crisis might be a winning message, but apparently McConnell thinks it is. And if he's actually nervous about losing that race and believes this, then the Democrats really are in a good position to push. Now, I don't know what they can get out of this. I don't know if that magic number is inviolable or whether or not they could actually push that in some way or find some other method.
David Dayen has some suggestions on that front. Things like make the unemployment insurance payments not taxable, or these type of things where you can not necessarily have any direct spending, but it's a tax cut. How can you argue against that if you're a Republican? These type of things. Maybe, it would be nice if there were automatic stabilizer. It would be nice if it was longer in terms of time. But there are other things you can do to alleviate some of the pressure that doesn't feel like you're spending money for whatever reason. There's a problem there with that. They're trying to get that, they're trying to get a $1 billion fund with FEMA to help cities and states to sort of backdoor that because we have real problem with that. But I don't know how well that's going. That's probably why, frankly, they're still trying to go through the weekend. But they have leverage, and it's hard to know exactly what that leverage, how much that leverage is, right? Because obviously the leverage goes away January 6th. Because the election's over. Maybe it goes away January 3rd. I don't know. At what point does it become the ship has sailed, as it were, for those candidates? And I don't know.
I don't know either, and I probably nobody knows. That election in Georgia is, it's such a crapshoot for, for both parties. Who knows? And they're working hard on suppressing votes down there. It's one of the things, most irritating things to me about this is that we valorize these guys like Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, because he stood up to Trump. But, he went right back to doing voter suppression and limiting the early voting places and all that stuff. So, you have to be real careful with these people. There are some who I think have made a true change of heart, but for the most part, these guys are going to use this even, especially maybe if they're the heroes who stood up to Trump, then they're going to be the ones with the credibility to do more vote suppression. So I don't know what's going to happen down there. And, also remember we're in the middle of a pandemic, and, it's very hard to know
who's going to show up and vote.
Yeah, who's going to show up and, how that's going to go and whether or not that's going to extend the pandemic. There are a lot of variables here that are unusual even in this unusual situation of a runoff like this, of having two races at the same time. In Georgia, this is, it's a very, unusual situation. But in any case, I do think that this is one of those times where if, they're clever in their negotiations, they can probably eke out more. And they could even, in the case of that, not taxing the unemployment insurance, they could, let the Republicans be the, take credit for the tax cut if they wanted to, say, well, that was our thing. We got in there, we didn't want them taxed. But of course, they don't want to do that because the only people they don't want to tax are rich people, and people on unemployment insurance aren't rich. So, but that would, that's another talking point for Warnock and Ossoff if they nixed something like that. They could use some of these things. And here's another thing, we've got the Republicans now. I just read this morning that they want to include language that would terminate the Fed's emergency lending program at the end of the year, and that just cuts off a huge amount of the Biden administration's flexibility if that thing is cut off, and then trying to get something like it passed again. It is a real poison pill, and they're not going to go with it. I don't think the Democrats can possibly do that, but it just shows you that, these Republicans, for whatever they're trying to do, whatever they need to do for their to maintain control of the Senate, you can only imagine the kind of things that they're, pushing behind the scenes because they really don't believe in this relief program at all. They don't believe in it. They don't want to do it. They don't care if people are suffering. they do not care. In fact, I think they want them to. I mean, now that Biden is coming in, they want people suffering so that they can blame it on the Democrats. They're looking forward to that. So, this is a very, very, when you're dealing with a party, a nihilistic, kind of rogue political party, which is what the Republicans have been, it just makes things so difficult because we have enough problems just with normal,
right?
Partisan, intra-partisan, differences to try and get anything decent done. And now you've got these people who are just ready to throw sand in the gears whenever they get a chance. So, I mean, I hope everybody's girding themselves for a tough time going forward, because it's not going to be easy either with the centrist Democrats, the Republicans. I mean, it's just going to be very, very tough. It's
going to be very tough. And like in this situation, I don't know. I mean, look, I've been quite explicit about, I believe, the series of failures in terms of legislative maneuvers and messaging and timing, as performed by Nancy Pelosi. I mean, she told everybody in April, assured everybody we're going to get billions of dollars for cities and states, and that clearly is not going to happen. And we're 8 months into it. And the implications are going to be huge. But I don't know I don't have a sense of how far you put, like at what point you're overplaying your hand in terms of the leverage they have now. Because like I say, they don't have any leverage on January 6th. We know that for sure. And then January 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. How much leverage do the Democrats have? I would imagine diminishing in some respects. So you get the best you can at this point because, and like I say, you're limited by the bad decisions that happened in the past. And you go forward. But I agree with you. The Republicans, they don't care. This is, if it wasn't for Ossoff and Warnock, they wouldn't be doing anything. And frankly, these outside expenditure groups, they should be doubling up on this stuff so that even if there is a deal, you have this resonating in the minds of voters that it was the Republicans who were standing in the way from it, in the way of it. And let's just, since we've touched on that, we got a minute or two, a couple minutes left here. There was leaked audio last week where Joe Biden said, my progressive friends want me to take some executive actions, and I'm not going to do that because it's unconstitutional. I mean, that's a bad sign to me that Joe Biden's already saying, like, apparently on record is saying 6 or 7 months after my presidency starts, that's that's when we're going to start to see these Republicans come around. I am very worried about that perspective because I think it's completely wrong.
It is totally wrong. I mean, I've been worried about it since, Joe Biden started running.
Right.
And, you and I have talked about this a lot over the last, year and a half as the campaigns were going on, was that, he seems to really believe this, that he has some kind of very special relationship with Republicans. And maybe he did 25 years ago, although even then they were crazy, but they're much crazier now. But it's not true. I mean, number one, there aren't that many that are still in Congress that were there when he was there.
Right.
I mean, he's been out for a long time. So whatever personal relationships he has. Now, he does not have a good relationship with Mitch McConnell. That's ridiculous. Mitch McConnell is a robot. He does not care whether or not he and Joe Biden have a history or whatever. It's just not. Look at what happened with Lindsey Graham.
Right.
They were actually close. I mean, look at what happened to that. So it's a real delusion on his part. I'm not sure whether or not, he believes it to the point where he will, hang on to it beyond all, evidence that shows that it's not working. I don't know. And I don't know whether or not people around him, I don't think Ron Klain believes that. I mean, nothing I've seen from him says that he thinks they can work with Republicans. And most of the people around him, even the ones that are sort of predictably centrist types, I don't think they're quite that deluded. So I don't know what to make of this other than my feeling is that exactly what you say. It's a bad sign, and we are going to have to keep our eyes on this.
Right.
And this is not, I always worried about it. I got it from an electoral standpoint. You want to tell hey, I'm everybody's president. I believe in unity. I'm restoring the soul of the nation, blah, blah, blah. I get it. He was trying to win an election. But did he believe that? Yeah, I think he did. And
Yeah.
I think that it is not a good thing. We don't have time to waste on this, right? Sitting there, trying to negotiate with Mitch McConnell on something that Mitch McConnell is not going to in any way cooperate is a big problem. So, at this point, I'm just hoping that maybe the Democrats can pull it off in Georgia. If that happens, we're in better shape. It's not perfect. We still have Joe Manchin to deal with. We've got Kirsten Sinema. We've got a bunch of people who are going to be
it's going to be, it's
part of the centrist, the gang of however many in the middle there with Mitt Romney and who knows who, Ben Sass maybe. And they'll be trying to run things. But still, it's better than Mitch McConnell. So, I'll take it. But nonetheless, it's going to be a problem. And we're going to have to push from outside to the extent we can to ensure. That's why I have no problem with any of the stuff that's going on with the left right now. People are saying, they need, they're being too picky and they're causing too much dissension and blah, blah, blah. If we ever needed it, it's now. There has to be a squeaky wheel because we can't trust Joe Biden to understand what he's up against. We just can't.
No, absolutely not. 100% not. And, and frankly, you and I have talked about this for months. Joe Biden is my second favorite type of politician,
right.
In that he's a cipher. And we have seen, I think, over the course of his building of his cabinet, which, some people say is in many respects incohesive. I think it is incohesive, but it is, I don't know. The only thing I can make an analogy is that, the best time when I was back in show business, I want to pitch a show and sell it is usually when the network is, obviously I'd love to go to a network that wants to feature Sam Seder material. But the second best opportunity is a network that's completely in upheaval and doesn't know exactly what they want. And then you can come in and sell it to them. And there's a little bit of that with the Joe Biden administration so far. Deb Haaland, I think, has just been named Interior Secretary. That's a big win. There was a big win on the Energy Department. I think in terms of like seriousness when it comes to climate change, we had McCarthy there as well, and we had the Jennifer Granholm, the former governor of Michigan. Both, from a climate change perspective, people are very excited. We have not seen a Rahm Emanuel type figure, and that's a good thing. So, I would say the cabinet's, sort of mixed in some respects, but certainly I think the Biden administration is showing that they can be pushed in certain directions. And
they're
that's a good
hearing
thing.
it, which I didn't necessarily expect. They're hearing it. They're hearing that when they put out their trial balloons, they're hearing which everybody does. All presidents, in these transitions, they throw out a trial balloon and they wait to see what happens. But often they don't hear what people are actually saying.
Yep.
And I actually feel like they are and are attempting to be at least somewhat responsive to it, they're creatively trying to find ways to be responsive to it. And that is a good sign. That says something. So
well, Heather, next week will be our last show of 2020. If we spend the whole show just saying thank you for ending this year, that would be enough. But we probably want to add some other things to it.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we can sing it, we can we can chant it, we can do whatever. But God help us. I am so glad to see this this period over, and maybe the pandemic is on its way out as well. We have this awful period right now, but sometime maybe in the next 6 months we can start to feel a little bit normal again.
Hope
hopefully.
springs eternal, indeed.
Absolutely.
And Heather, as always, thank you so much for your time today. We'll talk to you next week.
Okay, talk to you later.
Bye-bye.